What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and today we are going to do something different. We're going to explain the Dweller in Darkness from Marvel Comics. Now, for those of you guys who saw my video on a history of the Marvel Universe, and we talked about how the Dweller in Darkness was literally responsible for the collapse of an entire multiverse and the rebirth of all things, this video is going to sound somewhat familiar, at least in the beginning. But for those of you guys who never saw that, well, I don't know why, because honestly, not to toot my own horn, I think I did a great job with that series. So the Dweller in Darkness first appeared in Thor Volume 1, issue number 229. Technically, his real first appearance in Marvel was with Doctor Strange, issue number 30 in 1978, but regardless of how you slice it, the Dweller in Darkness, his origin has never really been explained in Marvel Comics. And in fact, the only thing that we really get in terms of how far back he goes regarding his involvement with the affairs of humanity, his attempts to gain power, comes with Adventures of the X-Men, issue number 12. Now, this story basically detailed a couple different things. Specifically, it was actually designed to bookend into the old school Thor origin of Galactus and expand on how all that happened and how Galactus actually became Galactus, but also to give us a kind of an explanation of why the previous multiverse had collapsed in the first place. Now, of course, we're talking about the multiverse that existed before the events of Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars in 2015, so I want to make sure we eliminate any confusion there. What we're basically told in Adventures of the X-Men issue number 12 is that the Dweller in Darkness was a Fear Lord very similar to Nightmare, and in fact, while they weren't really blood relatives, right? Blood relativity doesn't really exist among the various lords of hell or the fear lords or anybody like that. They were something akin to family, right? Insofar as like, I'm a fear lord, you're a fear lord, we're related through that sense. What the Dweller in Darkness had done is that because it feeds on fear and that fear bolsters its power, it came to that realization that if it destroyed the entirety of the multiverse, it would scare the hell out of everybody. And so it did that. What the Dweller did is he fractured the M'Kraan crystal. And the M'Kraan crystal itself, being a kind of hallway of doors for the multiverse, essentially turned into like a black hole. It started sucking in the entirety of the multiverse itself. Now, the goal of the Dweller in Darkness was to feed on all the fear that was let off by basically everything across the multiverse, and that in doing so, it would basically be reborn in the new multiverse with godlike power. We're not really told how his power would stand in relation to somebody like the One Above All or the Living Tribunal or something like that. We're just told it was trying to acquire a huge amount of power. Ultimately, the Dweller in Darkness was defeated when the Phoenix Force in that multiverse united the minds of everybody in existence to basically calm them down. And so while the Dweller in Darkness was stopped, the destruction of the multiverse could not be undone. During that time, the space explorer Galen was trying to figure out why his universe was ending. And while he never learned anything about the Dweller in Darkness and never got the actual answer for why it was collapsing, he was the last surviving person in his universe. He merged with the sentience of his universe and then coalesced in what was the creation of the new multiverse. And that's why when the new multiverse was born, a version of Galactus was put in every single universe across the multiverse. Now, having said that, in terms of how the Dweller in Darkness survived, we're not really given an answer. And in truth, I would say he didn't survive. That in fact, whenever a new universe is born, that is born with all the things that the universes previously had, especially when it comes to the realm of like Dormammu, the Dark Dimension, different things like that. And of course, we have an explanation video, at least I think we have an explanation video on Dormammu, which explains his role as part of the Faltine when he first arrived in the Dark Dimension, things like that. The important thing here is that what we know is the Dark Dimension was initially just a giant landmass. In the old Magik comics, we were told that like some kind of an event happened that fractured the Dark Dimension, but we were never really told what that event was. The result is that it basically led to the creation of the Splinter Realms. And so while Dormammu ruled a huge section of the Dark Dimension, along with his sister Umar, that the Dweller in Darkness, Nightmare, Mephisto, all those different people basically settled and came into existence based on those individual locations. Now, as far as how his origin unfolds inside of the new multiverse as it was created by Marvel, the Dweller in Darkness is just the result of humanity's fear. That's all it is. When the first thing felt fear for the first time, the Dweller in Darkness began to coalesce. The more the things began to feel fear with these sentient organisms, the more of a form the Dweller in Darkness began to take until it gives us his current form as it stands right now. And then from there, his power just expands based on the amount of fear that things feel. Now, in terms of his actual involvement with regards to humanity, what we do know is that in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme number 33, we were told that about 18,000 years before the modern day, essentially around the time of the second celestial host, when the Celestials arrived on Earth and basically caused the great cataclysm, right? The sinking of Atlantis, the almost complete obliteration of the Deviants, the Eternals fleeing from Earth, that the Dweller in Darkness existed at that time. And while he was not necessarily confined or required to stay within the various fear dimensions that exist in the Splinter Realms, that what the Dweller in Darkness did is that in order to bolster its power, it fed on the fear that was generated by the wars between the Eternals, the Deviants, and the humans. Now, something to understand here is that at that point in time, the deviants had largely enslaved humanity, and the Eternals would fight the deviants off and on, right? But they all kind of had this sort of circular fear of each other. The deviants were scared of the Eternals because of the power the Eternals had. The Eternals were scared of the deviants because the deviants could kill them. Humanity was scared of both because they didn't fully understand, and all three were scared of the Celestials. So it was quite literally just a giant melting pot of fear. This bolstered the power of the Dweller in Darkness quite significantly. Now, ultimately, again, in this Doctor Strange comic, it led to the arrival of a character by the name of Zered, and this was basically a sorceress that existed in the kingdom of Atlantis, specifically the capital of Lemuria, before it was sunk by the Celestials. And Zered had actually learned of the Dweller in Darkness's existence and the intention of the Dweller to continue feeding on that fear and basically conquer the world. And so what ended up happening is Zered actually reached out to Agamotto and basically drew on some of the power of the first Sorcerer Supreme and then faced off against the Dweller in Darkness. Now, because the Dweller is the embodiment of fear, technically he can't really be killed. The only way for the Dweller in Darkness to cease to exist is if nothing in the universe felt fear. But so long as something out there feels fear, the Dweller in Darkness will exist. And so the result of this is that because the Dweller couldn't truly be destroyed, instead it was locked inside the Splinter Realms in its own fear dimension and just basically confined there. And so much like what we've seen when it comes to a lot of these powerful beings, Mephisto, Chthon, people like that, he's always trying to find a way to escape his dimension and then arrive on Earth and potentially expand his sphere of influence out into the rest of existence and seemingly conquer everything. Now, during this time, and especially during the Great Cataclysm, right, when the Celestials showed up on Earth and basically unleashed holy hell across the world, that because so many groups, right, the Eternals, the Deviants, humanity, because they felt so powerless in the face of the Dweller in Darkness, they began to give in to despair. And what this did is it actually allowed the Dweller in Darkness to create a son, if you want to call him, who's actually called Despair. And that guy would actually become incredibly important later on. But again, you kind of fast forward over the years, the Dweller in Darkness doesn't really show up a whole lot. He just kind of shows up, periodically. For example, in Thor issue number 229 and 230, that the Dweller in Darkness kind of operating behind the scenes had actually began to sort of manipulate a few people and actually promised them that if they died, they would continue to live on forever. And this allowed these individuals to essentially become thralls of the Dweller in Darkness, actually engaging in different campaigns across the world that would ensure a kind of gain of his power. For example, Mr. Fear, one of the old school characters of Marvel who developed a fear toxin similar to what the Scarecrow did in DC Comics, was influenced by the Dweller in Darkness, and that by creating that fear toxin, he could bolster the feelings of fear in others, which would kind of imbue and power the Dweller in Darkness even more. And so all this came to a head in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme in issues 31 running all the way up to issue number 40. It was a pretty significant story. And the way this played out was in two forms. The first was a gathering of fear, and the second one was called the Great Fear. And the whole idea behind this is that the Dweller in Darkness sought to make an alliance with the other Fear Lords, specifically Nightmare, for the purpose of enabling him to basically conquer the world. The biggest issue that happened with this is the other Fear Lords are always vying to do the same thing. And so in reality, the whole thought process of Nightmare is, why would I help you conquer the world if that's what I want to do? And so of course Nightmare and a lot of the other Fear Lords ended up turning against him. Now in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme issues 38 through 40, what ended up happening is the Dweller in Darkness had actually abandoned his quest to be involved with the more powerful Fear Lords and actually grabbed some of the smaller Fear Lords. And during this time, he actually ended up invading Earth, right? Launching an attack against the planet and feeding on the fear of a ton of people, bolstering his powers. But during this time, his son Despair had actually approached Nightmare and essentially made Nightmare aware of the plans of what the Dweller in Darkness was doing. And so this led to a huge fight between the two. The biggest problem with this, and it was actually a great scheme by Despair, is that because the fight between Nightmare and the Dweller in Darkness was so extreme, they were both emanating fear and their influence was affecting humanity. So humanity was becoming just riddled with fear, right? They were absolutely horrified. But the more humanity became fearful, the more they began to give in to despair. And ultimately, that empowered Despair to the point that he was actually more powerful than both the Dweller in Darkness and Nightmare. Now, ultimately, Despair was defeated by the combined efforts of Doctor Strange and various other individuals. And so because of that, the Dweller in Darkness ended up just kind of slinking back to his fear dimension. Despair was kind of the end of him. Nightmare had taken off as soon as things started popping off. So the event came to an end pretty quickly. Following that, you never really saw anything from the Dweller in Darkness. The only things you really saw that happened were during like the old Journey into Mystery comics as part of Fear itself, right? So issues number 633, 636, 645, these are basically stories that dealt with the idea of the Dweller in Darkness potentially using what was going on with regards to the serpent, the long-lost brother of Odin trying to conquer the world, using the fear generated during the events of Fear itself as a way to bolster his power. But ultimately, it all kind of came down to Nightmare, who actually was able to utilize that fear more effectively than the Dweller in Darkness could. And that's all you really get, right? I mean, this kind of wraps it up. The Dweller in Darkness is a character who's almost never appeared in Marvel Comics. Outside of the fact that he belongs to a dimension called Evernai, we don't really know anything about him. We simply just know he's a fear lord. He feeds on the fears of humanity. He's almost succeeded in conquering the world a couple times, but was usually defeated through a combination of his own offspring Despair, somebody like Nightmare, or Doctor Strange and Clea. And that was it, right? That's really all you got. So I apologize if this is not necessarily up to par with regards to our normal videos explaining characters. Well, this guy just isn't quite on the same level as a lot of the characters that we do discuss, so there's just not a whole lot of stuff to bring to the table here. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.